Like with this issue, because it's such a big issue, well, specifically right now, and it's such a, like, it is such a rare issue, like not that many people have actually met many trans people. So it can kind of feel bigger than it actually is, like in terms of, you know, I bumped into Abigail on Joe Rogan, and kind of came into the debate that way. But up until that point, I hadn't really even thought about this sort of stuff for the better part of a decade. Like it just becomes your normal reality, the way you live your life. Like, you know, I'm kind of a workaholic, so I spend most of my time at work. So, or I have been up until the last couple of years. So it kind of really does just live in the background. And then, and people kind of that haven't met many trans people or any trans people think that it's going to be this big deal, and you know, you're going to be presented with a list of demand when you meet them, and they're like, you know, I normally interact with people for a while, and then when it kind of starts to get to the point where we're friends, I will tell them, like, so anywhere between 3 to 6 months of, you know, when I'm working with people, if it makes sense, you know, everybody will find out at some point, so that it's kind of, because they just don't make as much sense without that piece of information. So yeah, but the way it can feel when you're seeing it only through the media can be quite different. It can be discombobulating in some ways.
I think that's because it's been weaponized. And look, you know, for what it's worth, my point of view is, whoever people, if they just want to live their lives and just be left the heck alone.
Yeah.
Because it's been weaponized. What's happening is, it's the issue is, as I think Jordan Peterson has nailed, the imposition of reality.
Yeah.
It's like, you will accept this reality, and you will, like, I have created this reality for myself and it works for me. And you'll accept it. And that's like, that's kind of,
yeah, that's when, you know, and it really doesn't matter, like it really doesn't matter what the subject matter is. As soon as you start stepping over into other people's space, they're going to have a problem. Like it doesn't, like it's not a trans thing, it's just a general person thing. Like I've found this over the last couple of decades. Like even if people aren't on board, or they don't like it, or they disagree, or whatever, so long as you don't encroach on their space, they're perfectly fine. Like it's not, you know, so long as they are free to think what they think, they are happy to be polite, they're happy to, you know, be friends, blah 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 blah. It just is this whole, and this subject matter is kind of perfect SJW kind of fodder, and I kind of think that has been a trap in some ways as well, like alternative lifestyle, like kind of stuff, gay stuff, queer stuff, like it just is part of that realm. So it's perfectly suited to, oh, we're going to fight for these people's rights. But if you look, they, you know, like, I don't know that I didn't have any rights already. It's quite weird. So I don't even know where it started. I can't, like, because I was at work for the last 10 years, like it just kind of popped up on my radar, because I am naturally curious and interested in what's, you know, not what's happening in the moment, so to speak, but happening, you know, just general ideas. I'm always, whether it's religion or whatever, I'm always I kind of have obsessive little, like I have moments where I'm interested in this subject, so I'll suss that out for a number of months, and then something else will pique my interest and I'll move off onto that. And I bumped into Joe Rogan, so I started watching him. But had I not done that, I don't know that I would be aware that this would even happen. So I saw little bits of the beginning of it in probably just before 2010-ish. I was dating a woman that kind of was quite social. So she liked to go out to kind of queer events, sort of like lesbian alternate events. So I bumped into the politics grassroots in clubs and things like that, this dynamic where it kind of started to generate momentum, like kids going to uni that were gay, going out to alternative events and then chatting to each other and chatting politics and hanging out and stuff. I kind of bumped into it there a little bit, but you don't really take that stuff so seriously. Well, they're in their mid to late 20s because they're all kind of PhD kind of students. But so they're kind of, you take them somewhat seriously, but you're like, this is cafe kind of, elitist view kind of, there's no way this is ever going to hit mainstream. And then, you go home, you forget about it, you get on with your life, and then suddenly it blows up and you're like, where did that come from? Like, how is this even possible? So
it's been for a while though, Kev. Like, I work a fair bit in the Indigenous space. This idea is like, okay, so to be Indigenous, you actually don't need to be Indigenous. Like that was actually established really early. So if you're accepted as Indigenous by the Indigenous community, you are Indigenous. Doesn't matter, absolutely, like regardless of skin color, regardless of DNA, regardless of any of those things.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, well, that's how it's accepted. So it's like, people think trans is the thin edge of the wedge. It's not. It's not. It's not. This is an easier way to kind of fight, really, because with the whole race issue, it's just there's so much guilt associated with that. Like, I used to work in Arakoon, Lockhart River, Cowan, all up Cape York. The issues they are facing as a people are really, really different. So really, this idea that you've got this homogenous group of Indigenous people is just,
nonsense.
It's wrong. It's madness. But like we let that through. It's like, okay.
Well, yeah, because how do you
face that? Like, how do you?
You do that, and you're the asshole. So we've kind of politely stepped away from, because there's this lived experience thing that, like, there's just so many layers of things that that we've all allowed to get out of control, because, like, I don't know that there are any of us that haven't been part of the identity politics nonsense. We just had no idea where it would lead. Like Dr. Peterson talks about, when the right wing goes off the rails, that's very clear what happens. But when the left wing goes too far, we don't really know what that looks like, or we haven't up until now. So we have all incrementally let this stuff go through. Like, there's Aboriginality in my family as well. And I didn't think that we could prove it, but like, look at me, like, I don't have I have no idea what an Aboriginal experience would be like. I could imagine it, I could sympathize, but it's not part of my day-to-day reality. But my sister, who looks a lot like me, has actually, like, involved herself in some kind of benefits or something like there's something that she did as a single mother to kind of boost my nephew. Like, that shouldn't be allowed to happen, but it does. So we've kind of we're all guilty of exactly the same crimes, more or less. It's like overly polite to people. Step by step, we've ended up here. But then I kind of think a lot of the pushback is shooting itself in the foot by drawing a line in the sand and going, no, that's far enough, which is understandable. You can see why they make that decision, but then they go out of their way to be inflammatory, which just pisses more people off. Like, it pisses the people that are sympathetic to you off. And I saw, no, it's gone. I saw someone the other day or yesterday talking about part of the pushing back, part of the correction needs to be understanding that it's, incremental. You need to kind of push back firmly but fairly. You don't want to end up being like, and this is part of the extreme gender critical, and I don't know how involved you are in this, but some of the like extreme gender critical stuff that's pushing back is so far in like it's so far in the opposite direction that it quickly became as ugly as what they were pushing against
Yeah.
in the first place, and it just turns people's stomachs and makes them turn away. I've seen dozens of people come in, get peak trans, come in hot onto Twitter looking for information, go into gender critical spaces, and for a couple of days they're like, excellent, just give me all the information, all the talking points, I want to know everything. And then at a certain point, depending on who it is, you can actually see the point at which they go, oh, you're as crazy as they are, I'm just gonna back away here. And then they disappear and you never see them again because they don't want to engage. So you kind of have to be, we've all been trained to be diplomatic and polite and accepting. So in trying to push back on this stuff, you kind of need to bring people with you rather than be dogmatic in the opposite, you know what I mean, in the opposite way.
Exactly.
It's weird kind of, it's very strange trying to find your feet on, you know, how to go about this, which is why I've kind of been dancing around the outside.
I've thought a little bit about, and I think you've really nailed it with the Peterson, with Jordan Peterson's comment. And I think the reason why we can tell is because the right wing, and I mean, like, you know, National Socialism, I don't mean conservatives, they go the right wing and they think, you know, John Howard, like, no, John Howard not right wing, like, you know, he's conservative, but that guy's not right wing. Like, Nazis are right wing. They've got that collectivist mindset at the heart of it. But they were explicit. It's like, we want to do this to these people for these reasons. They kind of didn't hide it. Whereas the left dresses their I'm going to say this, I know this is value judgment, but the bitterness, the resentment and hostility up in the language of niceness. It really is, it's passive aggressive, and it's kind of really feminine. It's really feminine. It's really passive aggressive. Oh, you know, we're here to help. I'm not saying, like, you know what I mean? It's kind of okay.
Yeah, I see it every day. Like I kind of am almost involved in this. I lurk a lot, but I'm involved in it almost full time. And yeah, you like it. It just, it's crazy. Like, it is really.
See, it's really hard to fight against that, because if someone is stating that their intentions are good, like, how do you know that they're not? Like, you know, you can point at the outcomes and go, look, you've really stuffed this up. But you know, the person goes, look, it doesn't matter. My intentions were good. Like, I was on the right part. You know, I had the right intentions. You can almost not fight that. And so much is happening again, like in the Indigenous space. Like, I'll use that as an example because it's something I don't really know a lot about the trans stuff. As best as I know, excluding you, 5 trans people. But like, we don't hang out, like, it's acquaintances. It's like, yeah, g'day, how you going? You know, that kind of thing. Or I met them through work, my old job. When you look at the racial stuff, we know that looking the metrics that Kevin Rudd used for closing the gap, one of the few things he did really well, actually, he goes, okay, you know, we've been talking about reconciliation, we've been talking about closing the gap. This is what we mean. This metric, this metric, this metric, this metric, this metric. And I went, great. Finally, we've got actually something to aim for, rather than this huggy-feely, I don't even really know what you're talking about. Now, when the amounts of money that are poured into the Indigenous space sincerely have to be seen to be believed. And the amount of, and you've got all these organisations, which means people, working on it as well. So we're going backwards in all but 2 of the metrics. One of them is high school participation for years 11 and 12 for Indigenous people. That's definitely going forward. No arguments there. So we are definitely getting more participation in 11 and 12. Probably a good thing. Although we don't know yet, because it might be the case that, you know, these people could have or should have been tradespeople. So, I mean, hey, anyway, that's another issue in itself. But also, it appears that literacy and numeracy is going up in comparison to the rest of, mainstream society, so non-Indigenous society. And everyone's going, oh, that's great. But that's probably because the rest of mainstream, compared to the rest of the world, their literacy and numeracy rates are going down. So it's probably not. And like when I say this at meetings, people get so angry, but it's probably true. Like I'm trying to help. It's not that Indigenous people are getting better.
It's the other way.
It's the other way. And anyway, we're getting so much dilution because like now we're getting people like in Victoria in the last census, the amount of people identifying as Indigenous jumped, I think it was 23%. It might be like it's somewhere between 20 and 25%. I think it was 23. Now, yeah, I'm not making this up.
How does that happen?
All of these people, you know.
Maybe it's a social contagion.
Well, I think it's because all these things, it's trendy, there's money in it. It gives you a talking point. It's like, yes, I'm Indigenous. It means that you can. And I was actually having this conversation, this is going back many years ago now, with this lady who was like, whiter than me. I'm actually mixed race, not that it matters. And I don't do identity politics, but like this lady was really, really white. And she's sitting there going, oh, we found out just recently that we've got Indigenous heritage. We're Indigenous. I was like, Indigenous heritage means you're Indigenous? Okay.
Yeah.
Again, I shut up, being polite. And she goes, well, that explains why my kids' marks are so bad. Why they're not just performing at school. Why I'm not performing at school. And I'm like, excuse me? Well, it's because of the inherent racism in the...
Oh, fuck off.
I'm not kidding.
No, I believe you.
I am not kidding, mate.
How did we get here? How can people be this dumb? Like, I don't like I have that as well. Like there is, and apparently I found out recently we can prove that we are 1/16 Aboriginal or something ridiculous like that.
Yeah.
But I don't.
That's great, great granddad. Yeah.
I don't, I don't have. Yeah. That is not the way the world sees me. I don't need, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
jumping onto that bandwagon is just a bad look.
But see, that's it. It's a bandwagon. And so if you have a bandwagon, people want to jump on it. So when you have these bandwagons created, like that's the, fundamentally that's the issue. So you get people that weaponize it. We're back to, how and why this happened. You get people that are weaponizing this. So rather than just like shutting up and letting people live their lives the way that they want to live, and leaving people the hell alone, which I think is just such a, and really having lived overseas in a couple of, not just visited, but I've lived in a couple of other countries, that's a Western thing. Like the Chinese really aren't big on leaving people alone. It's like, they're a curious people. It's like, so what are the neighbors doing? Like, you know what I mean? And perhaps it is as a result of communism. I don't know enough about I'm not Chinese. I don't know enough about pre-communist China to know how they were, but
I don't think that would be in any communist. We don't really have that either as much. Like you see a lot of Americans, like with the COVID stuff that happened in Australia, Americans not understanding that our government has always been a bit, dictatorial in terms of, helmets and seatbelts, and if something like guns, we have always been quite collective in terms of if it is good for everybody and it's fair, then we will give up freedom for the good of everybody else. Like we've always had a bit of that as well. I've kind of noticed over time.
We're a convict nation. Like when I discuss this with my many American friends, they go, well, you guys were a colony, and you guys had to they had the Wild West kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But, we had our explorers, we had our. Why aren't you guys? And I had this American ask me, why aren't you guys more like us? And I said, you have to understand there's two things. How we were actually formed is different than you. You guys had the Pilgrims. We were a convict nation. And the second thing is that fact is going to inform the narrative that you tell yourself. So when you're a convict, you do things through authority. You don't do things against authority. Like authority is at the center of your life. It's all you think about.
Yeah.
And that narrative matters so much for us. Even our explorers, like the only really American explorers that were government sponsored in America were Lewis and Clark. Pretty much all the rest really were like this idea of like this trapper grabbed their rifle, grabbed a Bible, grabbed everything else, and went west to make their own fortune.
Yeah.
If they died, they made it rich, they whatever it is, but they did it themselves. They didn't do it with authority. In fact, they did it kind of against authority, and they went and set themselves up in a place, lived their lives the way that they wanted with their values, looked after themselves, and were self-sufficient. That's not what we did. We did the direct opposite. It's like bit by bit. Okay, we're going to set up a place here. In fact, in a lot of the places in the frontiers, like looking at the history, the police, especially the native mounted police up here in North Queensland, they were the first people going into a place. So it wasn't like this individual person trying to do their incompetent best to get on. It was like,
no, it was, yeah.
It was
It's really interesting. You just gave me another piece of the puzzle then, because I hadn't really thought about that much. I just had realised, no, we're a lot more collective, and Australians are much more willing to give up personal freedom for safety or for government control. We've always been like that. But yeah, that's a good piece of why as well.
We're convicts.
Yeah, well, I knew the convict thing, and I know that the first generation of Australian born to convict parents were deeply, like, they rebelled in the exact opposite direction. They were very law abiding and, quite conservative people.
Yeah.
And I kind of just assumed that had, moved on through the generations, and the convict taint kind of, a convict taint kind of mentality. But also at the same time, everything, well, because we're also a very hostile terrain kind of, like people wandered off into the desert and died quite a lot,
Yeah.
But any expeditions would have been government funded as well for the most part, or, like rich person funded and stuff like that. It is really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And those things matter so much.
Yeah.
But look, we're jumping all over the place. And this is totally cool. Thanks so much, mate, for talking. I'm enjoying this. And
me too.
I hope you don't mind the fact that it's a meandering conversation and we're jumping all over the place, but it's just a chat.
So when I was 15, I was always kind of odd. Like other people, my gender was always a thing. And I always kind of stood out like a sore thumb. It's so convoluted, and there are so many different things happening at one time, like because the trans umbrella has now, there's the transgender community, which are, like people who do transition, don't transition, non-binary. There's transsexuals who fully transition. There's transsexuals who only partially transition. There's cross-dressers who have some kind of sexual fetish. There's trans people who have sexual fetishes. Like there are several different groups that have been tagged under one umbrella, and these theories impact them differently in different ways. And some people go for them and other people don't. There are so many different things happening that it's just not, it's not a one sentence conversation, as much as people want to make it a one sentence conversation, because not everybody's interested. It just isn't, trans rights activists. Lots of these guys are 20 something, university students who are feminist allies, trying to be trans allies, trying to tell everybody else how to live, being hyperbolic online, telling people to go kill themselves, and just throwing words around carelessly and saying, I hope you get raped and blah, 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 blah. Like, I've had a lot of this shit as well, because I will speak out against gender ideology. I get told I'm a bootlicker, go kill myself, blah, 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 because I'm like, I'm sorry, but that's not trans. Like, no, that's not, men are not,
Go kill yourself.
Yeah, pretty much. It happens at regular intervals, and then I'll have, like gender critical feminists, telling me that I'm a woman LARPing as a man, and blah, 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 blah. You get it from both ends, like everybody does. There's this, uncivilizing aspect that the internet brings, because we haven't figured out a way to regulate it in a free speech, equally, like, it just is the wild, wild west of people behaving badly. So a lot of these, you know, trans allies are not trans. They're behaving badly online. They're young men thinking that they're being moral for their social justice warrior beliefs, that, you know, anyone who doesn't agree that trans women are women is absolutely a bigot, even though trans women, like, it makes no sense. Like, it just is craziness online that, you know, unfortunately people have started taking seriously. It's
Wow.
it's a whole thing. Like,
Mate, on that note, Kev, you've been, like, it's kind of brave of what, you know, because, and you do see that word overused as stunning and brave, stunning and brave, stunning and brave. But, like, mate, it kind of, it's,
well, it's about fighting for, like, like, my generation transitioned, and I kind of assumed that I would be joining the ranks of a very small, you know, cohort of, you know, like, mannish kind of women who live their lives as men. And, you know, like in the olden days, people would, you know, suddenly discover, oh, that's actually a woman, kind of, you know, like, I thought that I was the modern equivalent of that. Like, I didn't ever think I was becoming a man, or, you know, like, but because by the time you get to transition, you kind of have to make up your own mind about what you think about this. There is a lot of different individual approaches, and everybody thinks that their approach is right. But there definitely has been a generational shift where these theories that have come out of gender studies via Judith Butler and a handful of others have basically handed people their, you know, their deepest hope on a platter, and they, you know, then you are a woman or you are a man if you transition, which is not true. It's not reality, but it's what people want to hear the most. And they think that if they can convince everybody that this is true, that they'll be treated better. And it's like, I think you're coming at this ass backwards. Like, it's, you know, trans is okay. People are going to leave you alone. Like, you know, you let them do them and let you do you. And, you know, it's not that big a deal. Like, people don't really, you know, freak out that much. Like,
yeah, I don't think it would have been a big deal if people hadn't have
it
weaponized.
really wasn't. Like, I have in
Mate,
20.
can you talk about your journey then? Is that okay? Like, I mean, if you're comfortable doing that, like, run us through what happened with you.
In 22 years, I have had not one bad experience, which is kind of unique. I have a friend who's in the armed forces. He's like he's not a major, but he's like a decently high-ranking officer in the armed forces, and he's had two bad experiences. Like, if you leave people alone, they will leave you alone. I kind of, it's hard for people to understand, because if you were around me when I was a kid and growing up and in my early 20s, then it's obvious and it makes sense. But there are a small number of people, or a small percentage of people, who are born that are just incongruous. Like, you know, I passed as a guy frequently and often as a kid. Like, even if I spoke, people would still, it wasn't until, you know, a parent, like one of my parents, corrected people, that they would be like, oh, that's a girl. Which is not really that uncommon for young kids. Like, it happens all the time. That continued to happen. And then as I got through puberty, I had like the body gender dysphoria stuff, where it wasn't oppressive in terms of day to day. It just was not, like, it was not me. It was not comfortable. It didn't really get me down, but it was really obviously a thing. Like, and pretty much from the time I hit puberty, any kid that was a couple of years younger than me that I interacted with at some point would ask me if I was a boy or a girl. You're a boy or a girl? That was like something that happened, like, pretty much every kid I ever interacted with up until the age of 26, like, until I started transitioning. So like it was just obviously a thing. But if you don't encounter that in your personal life, it's very hard to understand, because everybody knows kids that were tomboys, or everybody knows a gay guy that's a little bit flamboyant, but it's a lot more than that, and it's a lot more persistent than that. So there are lots of things happening, but some people are aware of it from an early age, and they have such severe body gender dysphoria, like it's so big in their body that they hate their body parts, and then they choose to focus on that. It becomes really problematic for them. I wasn't really like that. Like it kind of bummed me out, but like that I had breasts bummed me out, but it wasn't something that I really super focused on. I kind of decided that the best way to get through was to pay as little attention as possible, and just get on with life, and not, you know, like if you can't change something, super focusing on it. Sorry, super focusing on it is probably the dumbest thing that you can do, because it's just going to make it worse. So I kind of went on with my life. And there were lots of things, like I used to play state level squash.
Oh,
You know, like, in every coach that I ever had would pull my mother aside and be like, holy shit, your kid moves like a boy. Like, you know, and they would say this constantly over and over. They'd pull her aside and she'd be like, yes, I know. She moves like a boy, blah, 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 blah. And I just, you know, had a lot of male traits that, you know, I also had female traits, obviously, but,
yeah.
you know, like it was just this weird kind of, you know, that is an obviously odd individual, but at the same time, I was generally likable and well accepted. You know, people noticed it, but, you know, I copped a little bit of shit over it, but not really. Like it was stuff that I didn't pay that much attention to. So I moved back to Sydney when I was 19, came out as a lesbian, and I started bumping into these articles. There's a lesbian magazine, monthly magazine called Lottle, Lesbians on the Loose. And every 6 months or so, they would do these articles about lesbians taking testosterone. And I remember it wasn't every 6 months. They did them at regular intervals. It just felt very regular for me, because it was kind of like this article looking at me going, I see you, but they never really got to the point of you can physically transition, because this is the late 90s, early 2000s, that women could have sex change was really like hush hush. Not many people, you know, like it just wasn't a thing. I'm sure you remember, like it just was like, I'm sure it's possible, but
Yeah.
like no one ever really thought of, like it just, you never saw it, you never thought about it. Like it makes sense that it's possible, but, you know, no one's ever seen it, so is it a thing? And I started seeing these articles about lesbians taking testosterone, but the articles came with pictures of lesbians that already looked like I looked like, and I was like, well, I don't really need to look any weirder than I already look. Like I already stick out like a sore thumb, and I wasn't like a butch kind of, like I wasn't like your typical leather jacket butch kind of lesbian. I was kind of sporty and androgynous, but there was something about the way I looked physically and my energy that was just like, it was just this weird situation where, you know, even like other women that I worked with would be like, you know, talking about groups of women and then kind of exclude me from like, you're not really a woman, like that kind of thing, even though they know I'm a lesbian, like, you know.
Wow.
And these articles also had really awful, like just toxic shit in them. Like, you know, these people taking testosterone would be like, oh, I now understand why men drive really fast cars and why men rape women, because I've got all this extra energy and all this aggression and all this stereotypical stuff. And I'd be like, no, like, no, that's no. And then my ex gave me this book called Stonebush Blues, which is kind of like this classic lesbian novel about a woman who is basically a cross-dressing butch lesbian, suit and tie, almost passes, except for the fact that she's, you know, like this big butch woman who has a, you know, like a buxom kind of shape, but cross dresses. Yeah, so and in that book, she decides in the 70s and early 80s that she's going to start taking testosterone and passing as a man because that will make her work life easier in the recession. She'll be able to get a job, blah, 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 blah. Because there used to be a lot of discrimination against lesbians in, you know, like in the States, and there still is to a degree from what I hear. But it was a novel, it wasn't real. And the woman that wrote the book had taken testosterone or maybe had an intersex condition, or, you know, like you'd see interviews of Leslie Feinberg on Donahue and stuff, and she was just this butch lesbian. And I was like, well, you know, it's a novel, it's not really real, like it's really interesting. And she totally nailed me. And I remember trying to have a conversation with Alison, who was my partner at the time, and kind of, because she'd given me this book and it freaked me out. And I remember trying to say to her, I'm like the person in the book, but like she did not want to hear it. Like it was just like a fail situation all around. And then a few years passed, and a friend of mine said that he was going to transition. And from the way he told me, like from the way that he told us, he was expecting us to reject him or freak out or something, because he was really hesitant to tell me. And I was like, oh yeah, I've heard about this, whatever, like, what does that mean? Like, it's really interesting. And he showed me this coffee table book of portraits and self-portraits of kind of the first cohort of public American trans guys from the late 80s and the early 90s. And it was kind of instantaneously clear that that was the solution to my problem, that I could live as a guy, that I could kind of alter my body so that I could be more embodied. And, you know, like it just, so many different things happened, and some of them I'm not even fully conscious of, or you can't fully articulate it because we just don't have the language for this yet. But there was something in my, like something at gut level that was like, that's it. And shortly thereafter, I started transitioning, like I was basically running. But yeah, it was at a time, people had this misconception that even back in, 20 years ago, that you had to go with hat in hand and do all of this therapy and go through a process. But it was already informed consent 20 years ago. Like I went to the gender center in the inner west, basically on my first visit with the counsellor there, got offered a referral to the endo, which I refused at that time because she freaked me out. But yeah, and then when I went to the endo, and he found out that I had been that I was a chef, and found out some of the places that I'd worked at, and he was like a mad foodie, so he pretty much wanted to talk about food more than he talked about anything else. So it was a very casual, like he was very clear. He was like, listen, we can change your external, we can make your life easier, we cannot change your DNA. Like, you're gonna have to think about this, and this. This is still, he didn't say it was experimental, but he was like, we don't know everything about this, so we know it's not going to kill you in 10 years from now, but like there possibly may be things that eventuate from this, like from you doing this, allowing you to do this, that you're going to have to take responsibility for, which was kind of the emphasis back then. It was kind of like, listen, this is something to take seriously, and like part of the informed consent thing was you're going to need to take responsibility for your decision, good and bad, which we have gotten away from. So I kind of transitioned in a group of, anywhere. There were a couple of different groups. There was FTM Australia, that was once a month kind of group meeting with, partners and, trans guys. where we did, you know, like support group kind of stuff and partner facilitate, like, because when you're transitioning, your partner is, you know, kind of as affected as you are, even though they aren't really changing anything about their body. Their life is utterly, you know, upturned. So, you know, that was kind of good for, you know, my partner forming friendships and forming a network group and sharing information with each other. And then there was another like a thing through the gender center where it was like group counseling, like peer counseling. That ended up being, I think it started out once every 2 weeks and then kind of stretched out to once a month. And there were probably like 20 to 30 guys at the first kind of support meeting that would come and go. Like it wasn't a big meeting, but there were a few people that drifted in and drifted out and their partners would come along. And then with the gender center one, there was like anywhere up to 12 people that would come and go. And we kind of did that for a few years until my partner at the time graduated university, because I was kind of financially supporting her through uni. She finished uni and then got a job overseas. So we kind of packed up and moved overseas for a bit. She's still over there, but yeah, that kind of ended that. And then when I came back, I was pretty devastated because I got dumped and done over pretty bad. Yeah, so I kind of came back and a few of my friends kind of hung out, but she also kind of called everybody and cried. So I kind of lost most of my network of support. There are a couple of trans guys that I was still friends with at that point, but I started cooking again and then lost contact with, you know, the community at large. I've dated a few. I only tend to date lesbians or bi kind of, you know, because there's the whole butch femme part of the lesbian. There are a lot of, there's not one gay community or one lesbian community or one trans community. There are little enclaves of groups of like-minded people. So, you know, I kind of would be part of the scene from time to time if I was dating someone that wanted to go to events, or if I found an event that I wanted to go to. So there are people that I can go and hang out with. If I go to an event, I'm most likely to bump into people that I know and get along with. But I've kind of been flying solo pretty much since 2007-ish. I haven't really been part of the trans community per se, apart from flits in and flits out here and there.
Wow. How long did it take
to transition?
Yeah.
You start passing pretty quickly. I didn't have chest surgery for 18, 19 months after I started testosterone. So within about 6 months, because you get oily and then you take on water, and you start noticing like hair patterns will slowly come in. Your voice kind of drops slowly, but then you kind of have to work out. I didn't do this, but like a lot of guys will work out how to speak in a lower register because it's not as comfortable to speak in your the normal voice that you had. That can be quite squeaky.
Your voice, right?
You know, like, and then you kind of in from about the 6 month to 12-month mark, or, you know, even a little bit for 14-15-month mark, you can be in this weird kind of in between where you are taken as a guy socially in some situations but not others. I had group situations because I worked at Australia Post at the time, and I was a relief postie, so I'd be sent out to different centres, like, you know, like the other side of the city for work that day. And I'd be in group situations where one of them, like 3 or 4 people, and I'd be in the group, and 2 of them would think that I was a guy, one wouldn't be participating, and the other one would be referring to me as she. And you would think, holy fuck, I'm about to get found out here. But they just never put it together. Like, they're calling me he, that one's calling me she, they're all chatting, I'm standing right here, not a single person twigged.
in some ways that's kind of reassuring, you know, in a weird kind of like way. It's like, oh yeah, whatever. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
you know, like, and you kind of realize like the further in you get to passing, the less interesting it is, the more it is just your reality.
It's just who you are.
You know, like it just is the way that the world sees you, like, you know,
There's,
and you kind of realize the more you bring it up and make it a thing, like the more you talk about it,
okay.
the more problematic it can become. Like people get sick of it. It's like there's nothing more pathetic and more rude than constantly bringing yourself up in social situations. Like how conceited is that? Like, so you
Yeah.
kind of learn to chill, like cool the jets, relax into it. People are going to do what they're going to do, and you're going to have to deal with that either way. Um, but with the politics of social justice and, you know, trans fitted into that so neatly. Like I don't think it really started out as a, you know, like let's, you know, make this the issue, more so let's find more ways to dump on Western society and say it's the worst thing on the world, and it just slotted in quite nicely.
Yeah, you fit our agenda. Like, you know,
Yeah,
you are a tool that we can use to achieve our aims.
which is basically just to like how to unpack this, like how to fight back against this nonsense that is happening, and like how to even achieve that when you're like the people that are doing this are fully indoctrinated. They believe that they're doing the right things. They're utterly convinced. They're completely blinkered, so they only see what they want to see. So how you then come about trying to flip them so that they can see that they're actually not doing what they think they are doing is kind of a delicate operation. Like you really need to be, it's not a blunt, you know, it's not a blunt object at all. So, you know,
Yeah, it's like talking to anyone that's you know,
yeah,
sincerely inculcated. But so you go through this process that there's talking, then there's hormonal taking, and then there's like, is there one operation? Is there a number of operations? Like,
I had chest surgery.
yeah,
I didn't do anything. I haven't done anything else yet, so I haven't even had a histo yet.
right.
Genital surgery in Australia for trans guys, and I could be a little bit wrong about this. Back in like, because I was never really that interested. Like,
Yeah,
there's kind of this misconception that all the trans people have genital surgery.
yeah. Sorry, that's what I thought. Yeah,
Very, 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 very few.
yeah,
It's you know, like, and there's good reason for that. You know, like it's super expensive to start with.
yeah. I suppose it
You
would
know,
be.
like it's super dodgy, super risky. And if you know, like it's one of those things where it's like if you have any level of sexual function, like where you can get by,
Yeah,
then letting someone take a scalpel to your genitals is just a really risky proposition because you could lose that very easily. So
yeah,
it's this big gamble. And I think that is the, I think moving forward, people like the wider population are understanding that these surgeries are dicey, and not necessarily well advised to start with. Like, so therefore, most trans people actually don't do them is probably a good thing for people to understand. Like, that can be weaponized, which can be problematic. But these surgeries are for, you know, not many people. If you know, like I kind of saw it as, you know, because there are trans, like I'll stick to trans guys. So there are trans guys who are butch lesbians, and there's this thing called stone butch that I've seen a few gender critical people throw around. Like, oh, why don't you just be a stone butch lesbian? Like that's a person, like you just need to accept yourself, and that's the healthier option. But the stone bit, of the word that they're throwing around, like that term they're throwing around, means that anything from their partner is not allowed to see them naked, their partner is not allowed to touch them at all, their partner's only allowed to touch them in certain areas. Like, people can be quite dysphoric. And in that kind of instance where you have no sexual function because, you know, you hate your penis, it disgusts you, you know, you're so not into having a vagina that you won't let anyone touch you or you won't let anyone see you. If you have that level of sexual dysfunction, then maybe these surgeries might be worth a crack if, you know, like if you're willing to take the risk and the responsibility that it could go wrong. But the other thing that's not necessarily focused on is that they don't go wrong all the time. They can go horrifically wrong, but that's not, you know, like normally it's a series of surgeries. There can be a couple of complications that are mostly fixed or completely fixed. Like the horrific cases that you hear about are horrific. And I think we need to like have a system where people go into, you know, these surgeries fully aware and fully briefed of the percentage rates of, you know, anything that can happen so that they can make informed choices. But it's not quite what people think it is. Like these, like people that opt for these surgeries are not just opting for them willy-nilly, and they're not having a super active sex life before, like in the way that people think that they, like there's a little bit of misunderstanding there that people aren't quite grasping, like that, like I've tried to bring it up a couple of times and people won't touch it. Like they just don't want to know. They've made up their minds what they think about this already, and they are not interested in hearing any additional input whatsoever. So,
Well, poor fool then, I would say. Look, what would you say to someone that's, you know, going through what you went, which I suppose you could call gender dysphoria? Like, you know, what would you say to them?
most people tend to research a lot of this stuff online. There's a lot of, you know, pre-existing pages that go up, a lot of, you know, looking at things, finding out about complications, looking into the complications, looking at the health risks. I assume the kids are still doing this. Like they seem to be glossing over. There's a lot of, oh, that's not going to happen to me. I think going into it, being sure, or as sure as you can possibly be, because I wasn't even 100%, you know, like it's a gamble. You're taking a gamble.
Wow.
It might work. You might be trapped forever in a horrible situation. Like you kind of need to weigh this stuff up. Like, can you imagine you're happy being you, being trapped forever in something that didn't work out? You know, like you kind of have to think about that and weigh up, you know, like this is kind of harm reduction in some ways. Like people need to go in with their eyes very, you know, as open as they can be. Like you can't see into the future. Like I didn't know that it was going to work out, but I knew that I was able to take responsibility for myself should anything go wrong, that I wasn't going to turn around and, you know, like if there was a case of like if I had been involved in a case of malpractice that I had put myself into, then part of that is me. Like I kind of, you know what I mean? Like I kind of accepted that I was doing this with doctors' help, and they were very clear about what they did and didn't know. And that has been presumably obliterated under this current social justice, you know, trans rah-rah nonsense that's been going on, that, you know, there are a lot of people pushing back on that. And I think we'll ultimately be successful. But like if there's a trend, like if there's a person with gender dysphoria, like there's really no rush. Like take your time, do your research, talk to a number of people, you know, ask hard questions, find out what you're talking about. Don't assume, you know, like I know trans guys in the States, like in Canada, they do basically like all of the surgeries are covered by their version of Medicare.
Mm.
So there was a guy that flew to Texas to have genital surgery. He had a 15-minute phone consult with the doctor before he flew down. And this is someone in their late 30s or early 40s at this point, just not, you know, like being critical about, you know, you think if you have a 15-minute phone call with the doctor before you get there, when you get there, you're going to pin this doctor down and be like, listen, like, let's have a conversation. But that didn't, there's this, you know, like there was just this, oh, well, this is just what's going to happen. And, you know,
well, that leads in, I mean, here in Australia, is it too quick? Like, I mean, is part of the process, hey, you know, maybe there's alternatives because, you know, is it the case that we should be treating minds rather than bodies?
I think with kids, yes, to a point, because you're an ex-copper, aren't you?
Yeah.
What demographic of the population has most access to black markets?
Kids. Yeah.
So you don't want to risk a situation where you're turning drug dealers into hormone therapists. Like, it needs to be balanced. It needs to be well thought out. It needs to be, you know, like you, and this is kind of coming from a lot of the, like my friend Xander is a social worker who has done a lot of, you know, trans therapy. He's like, you can affirm without affirming. Like, you can do the whole, you know, yes, I hear you, you feel like you are blah, 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 blah. You see yourself as, you know, like you can word things so that you're not affirming, so that you see them as that. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, see, that's such an important thing for me because
therapy, but that's not what's happening. You know, like,
well, what is happening? Because like that's such this idea that a psychologist or a psychiatrist can affirm reality.
Yeah.
I think that's mad. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Don't be sorry. It's crazy.
Okay.
It's kind of this thing where it used to be this thing where it was like, I want to transition for whatever reason. And I, you know, like I'm based in reality, I'm not based in reality, like taking responsibility. Like there were lots of different things happening. But the therapist was like, okay, you are a man. We are going to do the best that we can to, you know, transition you into a feminine role or into a female role or whatnot. But you can't actually become a female. Like, you can get close, but you're not going to get all the way there. We can't change your chromosomes or your DNA, or, you know, like we can move things around, but that's the best we can do. And the hormones will alter your biochemical situation somewhat, but this is not a perfect solution. It has turned into, oh yeah, you're totally a boy. Like, what? Like, it's madness. And it's, you know, like, it's not true at all, you know.
And that's it. Like, I really, Kev, I have this real concern because I was never a trained negotiator, but I did a lot of negotiations because, like, you know, it came to me.
You have that personality.
But one of the things that I learned from both training and unfortunately from experience was that you don't validate delusions. And if you do, to solve a short-term problem,
people think that these doctors and therapists and people think that they are being. I saw a tweet earlier about someone who was like, oh, I've got all of this access to all of these unused hormones. I'll send them anywhere in America. Just send me a thing. They think they're doing the right thing, but it just is crazy. Like, this is serious stuff. Like, it needs to be seriously considered, and you need to be, you know, as fully informed as you can possibly be and think this thing out fully, not just jump on a bandwagon. And that is what's been happening. And we're now so deep, like, you know, we're so far along from that origin point that we need to be really careful about how we bring this back, because some of it, there is no coming back.
There's no coming back.
You know, there's a lot of people that are like, oh, we're just going to draw a line in the sand and fix this, and, you know, tell these people what's what, and that's it. And it's like it's moved well beyond that point. Like,
yeah,
you need to really think about this and play it forward and have as much information as you possibly can before you wade into this, because there's a lot more happening here than people tend to think. Like there's yeah, I don't really know. I'm not in a strong position to say that that's, I don't think you transition like that whole, I don't like that whole you're transitioning to your authentic self, like as if you were fake before. I really don't, that doesn't resonate with me. That's not it. Like I'm at ease with myself a lot more in a way that wasn't possible before. Um, yeah, I don't, there's something about that authentic thing that just is, does it
Doesn't resonate
ring as
with you.
false to you as it does to me? Like it's just like you are you and you're authentic, like however you are, like, you know what I mean? Like you don't have to do anything to be your authentic self, like that doesn't, that I don't know what to do with that. I think that it's certainly a lack of, especially with what seems to be happening with the younger kids jumping on the cool bandwagon, fulfilling some kind of spiritual need. Like there's something deep happening. I don't really know that we have a grasp fully on what that is.
One of the things that kind of clicked in my mind is what phenomenologically, what how you're being treated is because kind of like you're feeling good in your skin, you're feeling this is who I am, and people are kind of like treating you differently. How important is it, like the acceptance and the treatment and everything else? Like, how much did that influence your decision making process personally? Like, did that have
Be
there's
taken as a guy or like to be
well, because look, there's a certain degree of social awkwardness there. Because like the way I would feel if I saw all these other people uncomfortable, I'd kind of like want to make them feel less uncomfortable and awkward. Do you think that impacted like this concern about other people?
there's a lot of that at the moment. Xander just released a clip for Fair talking about one of the reasons that he transitioned was because he in the evidence, like the example that he gave was he was walking along the street pre-transition and someone from a car threw a bottle at his head and gave him a hard time. Um, and he decided that transition would make his life easier. And I mean, it was a 5-minute clip, so he's generalizing quite wildly, but that then leads to well, we just need to socially re-engineer society to make it more fair, which is a fool's errand. I kind of I have pretty thick skin and I process things quite externally, so it kind of did weigh on me a little bit from time to time that, well, because I'm very friendly and
Yeah,
people it wasn't like an everyday kind of thing. Like it was obvious that I was different and people would be awkward on occasion talking about, well, yeah, I suppose you kind of really are part of, one of the girls as well, but that makes me really uncomfortable to say that. I would just kind of, you learn to zone that stuff out. Like, I was well aware of my own reality and it was a little bit uncomfortable, but, like other people have, you know, far harder lives than I ever did. So my mother was quite good at, you know, move along here, nothing to see, don't feel sorry for yourself. Everyone has their cross to bear. This is yours, you'll live, don't worry about it. Like I wasn't placated very much when I was a kid because I'm also the youngest. So, like I kind of was I'm kind of a roll with punches type person. So it kind of, yeah, like transition certainly alleviated that a little bit, but it was, for me, the focus was kind of more internal. Like it was, like on one level, I've never been able to string this thought coherently together, but it was kind of like, at age 26, because you're meant to go through these developmental stages and have these, rituals of coming of age and graduating high school and the social kind of rituals that go with that, but none of the uniforms ever fitted me. So you kind of get to 26 and you're still, wearing the same clothes and same uniform that you've always worn. I still felt like I hadn't hit adulthood in some kind of way. That, transition kind of for me was also about kind of becoming an adult, like taking responsibility, being the master of my own, little universe kind of on one level, but not like.
So what does being accepting mean and look like?
I think people accepting you for where you are on the, like people just being like treating you like you are no different than anybody else. Like, I don't think that it needs to be that the whole song and dance around, trans, brave and courageous kind of that was always a bit embarrassing for me. Like I made a decision. I went through a process. I'm living my life. I kind of think it is just accepting people for who they are on the day that you meet them, like, or the day that you're interacting with them. They're not really. It's really, like it's very odd. Like it's a very strange thing to do to go through a sex change. Like it is pretty out there, but on a like in a theoretical way, it's really out there. But on a day-to-day basis, it's kind of, it just is what it is, I don't even know. Like I kind of think the whole, being accepting and, celebrating, like I think that's I just don't, it's not where it's at. You meet people, you like them, you don't like them, they have their history, you have yours. Like the people aren't, it's kind of almost setting up tiers of, hierarchy almost, and it's like elevating someone further up the hierarchy for no good reason whatsoever. It's like this social, you know what I mean, like social acceptance in like in the air quote kind of, let's do it visibly and put this forward, is elevating social status when you've really done absolutely nothing to deserve it.
You're right, and maybe that's the appeal of this.
The social contagion.
The fact that it's happening.
I think with a lot of the kids, like the feminists often talk about, you will hear the feminists talk about these young, mainly girls, rejecting femininity, rejecting they're scared to enter womanhood because porn and patriarchy. But when you actually go and speak to the kids, it's actually part of this whole oppression Olympics. It's kind of conceptually different. They're rejecting cis heteronormativity in terms of, I don't want to be a normal person. I want to be elevated.
Special.
Yeah.
I want to be
seen as special. Like,
yeah.
So it's not really about, and it doesn't seem to matter how many times you tell the feminists, listen, like even there are two Aarons that run an organized, trans guys that run an organization that is very gender critical, that have done, one of the Aarons has done a lot of research into this and spent a lot of time on TikTok and Instagram trying to talk to these kids, like these high schoolers, and find out, like really reading what they say for, tens of hours, hundreds of hours probably even. And he's like, that when they talk about it, they talk about opposing cis heteronormativity, which is part of this whole communistic oppression Olympics. You're at the top of the pile by being at the bottom of the pile. Like you need to be the most oppressed to get the most cachet. Like it's this twisted kind of thing. I think there's a lot of that involved. I think there's a hell of a lot of that involved because they talk about it constantly.
Yeah, it's really upside down. So puberty blockers, what's your take on that?
I'm looking forward to the day that they are no longer used. They're just, how can you be, I don't know how anyone could be for them. Like the idea that you, like it's this, puberty is a 10-year long process, possibly even longer, because your brain development doesn't, like you're not fully developed in the brain until you hit your mid-20s.
Yeah.
So one could argue that that is the end of puberty, certainly the end of when you're in the youth kind of demographic. And we are thinking that we can just willy-nilly disrupt it and then swap it over. And like they've kind of done this thing where they're like, we know what the science looks like if someone starts taking hormones at an early age. And so far the experiment isn't over, but so far the data looks acceptable. And then at the same time, they're looking at these precocious puberty kids that they've been giving puberty blockers for a short time, and then letting them have a normal puberty, and that science looks okay. So therefore, we can just add those two together and everything will be fine. And it's like, if you can't see the problem with that, like, I can't help you. I don't know what to say to you. Like, I don't really think that there's any reason. I'm not against childhood transition utterly, because I think, they are the demographic that is most likely to get black market access. And there are a number of trans women who started on black market hormones at age 13. Like, I know half a dozen of those people. So they're clearly, that's an area that needs investigation. But I don't know how you could actually argue for any, like, even really social transition. Like, I don't know how you could argue for that. Like, especially not for, prepubescent kids. Like, just let them be kids. They'll sort it out when they sort it out. They don't need you to save the day and tell them who they are, because
so true.
How could you possibly know that?
And that's it. And it's like the psychologist who is like validating something. That's actually that's the psychologist, the psychiatrist putting themselves at the center of it. That's a way of them empowering themselves.
Yeah, they're on the gravy train.
Arbiters of reality. That's really dangerous.
Yeah, it is.
It's so dangerous.
Gravy chain of brave and accepting, or brave and courageous, by being like, I'm the one that accepted them.
I'm the one that did that. Yeah.
If someone seemed like because I've been in the trans world for such a long time, if someone is visibly in transition, or is at the start of transition, and I can kind of figure out that's a guy that wants to be seen as a woman, then I will swap pronouns, because I am well practiced by this stage. I don't see them as a woman. Like, I don't expect you to see me as a male. Like, that's not the point of this at all. Like, when I tell people I'm trans, I expect them to see me as trans, but I have little control over that. So the pronouns thing is, I haven't really had to do any they, them yet. I kind of don't want to, but I'm not in a strong position. I kind of think use the pronouns that are most appropriate, like most visually appropriate. I don't think they should be demanded. There are trans people like Scott, and I think one of the Aarons or both the Aarons are happy being called she. I kind of think I can appreciate why, like, because it's not really something that matters to me, but at the same time, it's kind of really rude. Like, to be doing that on one level is, it's just more dogma, and I don't think it's helpful. So I kind of think, if you don't want to call someone by the pronouns that, like, if you don't want to call me he, that's fine. Don't call me he. Just don't use pronouns, or say they, or my name, or, like, there are ways around these things to manage this. I think that more dogma is is not helpful at this point. But I do appreciate that, when it feels like an assault on your, your whole worldview, then yeah, of course I understand why some of them are being really strict and stringent about that, but I don't think that it helps them either, because the number of ex-gender critical people that I have encountered just on Twitter is really remarkable, and it's because things get so dogmatic and there's no flexibility and no room for the reality of the nuance of this situation that people just get fed up and leave. Like,
oh, sorry, the ex-gender critical, they're the people that we were discussing at the very beginning that kind of like,
yeah.
Okay.
So they kind of come in, the ex-gender critical people are people that have been peak trans. So they bump into this crazy queer theory, they, them, furry, the Matt Walsh type stuff that was in the movie. They bump into that, realize that there's a problem. They jump online looking for information, looking for like-minded people, and then they bump into
weirdos,
hardcore,
absolutely, people who are kind of unkind and not driven by love.
Yeah, pretty much, and then they realize, oh shit, these people are the same as those people, and they back away, which means it's just going to take even longer for this stuff to be resolved, because